The dawn broke over the Italian hills with a pale, tentative light, illuminating the scarred landscape where villages had been shelled and fields torn apart. Lieutenant James Carter stood at the edge of the ridge, surveying the horizon with eyes that had grown sharp from months of combat. Below, his men moved quietly through the mist, carrying the weight of packs, rifles, and unspoken worries. Every step was a negotiation with fatigue, fear, and the memory of comrades lost in battles that seemed endless. Yet there was an unspoken bond between them, forged in fire and perseverance, a silent promise that none would be abandoned. Private Thomas Lewis trudged along the muddy path, pausing to glance at a small grove of olive trees that had somehow survived the bombardment. He thought of home, of the streets of Harlem he had left behind, and of the older men in his regiment who had told stories of service stretching back through generations. They were Buffalo soldiers, descendants of men who had fought in wars long before the world had recognized their courage, and now they carried both legacy and expectation. The landscape around them was harsh, but it was also a stage on which their valor could shine, untarnished by the doubts that lingered at home. A sudden crack of gunfire shattered the morning calm. Carter dropped to one knee, signaling his men to take cover behind the remnants of a stone wall. Bullets whined through the air, cutting the silence into jagged fragments. Corporal Sammy Johnson barked orders, directing men to flank the enemy while keeping their lines intact. The chaos was almost a living thing, a dangerous rhythm of advance and retreat, fear and resolve, life and death. In these moments, training merged with instinct, and the bonds between men became both shield and weapon. Tommy fired his rifle with careful precision, watching as enemy soldiers faltered under the disciplined, coordinated return fire. He felt a jolt of adrenaline, a simultaneous surge of terror and determination. Every shot, every movement was an assertion of survival and defiance, not only against the Axis forces, but against a world that had questioned the value of men like them. In each heartbeat, each breath, each glance exchanged with a fellow soldier, there was an affirmation. They were worthy, they were capable, and they were unstoppable when united. As the skirmish continued, Carter noticed a group of villagers crouched behind rubble, their faces pale and anxious. He gestured for one of his men to provide cover, moving closer to reassure them. Words were unnecessary. The soldier's presence itself spoke volumes, a shield of courage in a landscape ravaged by fear. The villagers, once skeptical, now saw in these men a quiet heroism, an unexpected embodiment of justice in a world teetering on chaos. Even in war, there were moments where humanity pierced the darkness, and the Buffalo soldiers provided that light. Hours passed in relentless motion. They climbed hills, crossed streams, and navigated trenches, their bodies aching but their spirits unbroken. Each encounter with the enemy tested their endurance, yet each victory, no matter how small, strengthened their resolve. Carter moved through his squad with the careful attention of a father and the precision of a strategist, offering encouragement, correcting positioning, and silently mourning those who could not continue. War demanded both sacrifice and attention, and the men of the 92nd Infantry Division bore both with quiet dignity. By evening, they had secured a small ridge overlooking a valley where enemy positions were entrenched. The sun set in fiery streaks across the sky, casting long shadows that danced over the broken earth. The men set up makeshift camp, tending to wounds, cleaning weapons, and sharing what little food remained. Conversation was low and measured, punctuated by laughter that seemed almost rebellious against the day's horrors. Even in the shadow of battle, camaraderie persisted. It was a lifeline, a tether to humanity that refused to be severed. Carter sat apart for a moment, staring at the horizon and thinking of the country that had questioned their loyalty. The irony was sharp and bitter, yet he refused to dwell on resentment. Instead, he focused on what mattered: survival, victory, and the legacy they were building with each step. These men, marginalized at home, were demonstrating bravery, skill, and leadership that transcended color, proving through action that valor was not bound by prejudice. The ridge, scarred and battered, became a symbol not just of strategic advantage, but of a moral triumph, a testament to courage under fire. Night fell quietly, broken only by distant gunfire and the occasional cry of a sentry. The soldiers huddled near small fires, sharing stories, mending uniforms, and offering comfort to one another. In the soft glow of lantern light, the weight of history pressed upon them. The generations before who had fought, the country that had doubted them, and the world that still required proof of their worth. And yet, in the laughter of a young private, the quiet nod of a corporal, or the steady gaze of their lieutenant, there was something unbreakable. The bond of brothers forged in arms, a courage that had survived prejudice, battle, and the relentless testing of fate. As Carter finally lay down to rest, he felt a deep, unspoken pride. These men were more than soldiers. They were proof that heroism could not be confined by color, that dignity could flourish even in a world that sought to deny it. The hills of Italy, scarred and silent under the starlit sky, bore witness to their valor. The Buffalo Soldiers had fought not only for victory against an enemy abroad, but for recognition, respect, and the eternal affirmation that courage belongs to all who dare to wield it. The morning air was sharp with frost as the Buffalo Soldiers prepared to advance toward a heavily fortified hill that had resisted Allied forces for weeks. Lieutenant Carter moved along the line, checking rifles, listening to the nervous murmurs of young soldiers, and offering words of encouragement. "Remember, stay low, watch each other's backs," he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety curling in his stomach. The men of the 92nd Infantry Division had faced prejudice at home and skepticism abroad. Yet here they were, ready to face an enemy that would give them no quarter. Private Lewis glanced at the trench ahead, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had seen friends fall before, men who had shared laughter and prayers the night before, now silent beneath the soil. Yet fear did not dominate him. It sharpened his senses, made him alert to every movement and sound. He exchanged a nod with Corporal Johnson, a silent acknowledgement of shared resolve. They were brothers in arms, and the bond between them was stronger than any rifle or strategy. The attack began with a low rumble of artillery, the hills shuddering under the repeated blows. The soldiers moved in coordinated advance, bullets cutting through the air, smoke curling from burned-out farmhouses and trees. Carter led from the front, his figure a steady beacon for his men. The terrain was treacherous, riddled with mines and debris. Yet every step taken forward was a triumph against both physical and symbolic obstacles. Each soldier understood that this was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a demonstration of courage, skill, and dignity in a world that had long denied them recognition. As they reached the base of the hill, a machine gun nest opened fire, sending a hail of bullets that tore through earth and foliage. Screams, shouts, and gunfire filled the valley, creating a cacophony that threatened to overwhelm the senses. Carter called for suppressing fire, and the men responded with precision, advancing strategically under cover and returning fire with calculated determination. Private Lewis felt the recoil of his rifle with each shot. Yet he remained focused, his eyes scanning the hillside for movement, each heartbeat a mix of fear, adrenaline, and purpose. In the chaos, moments of humanity emerged. A soldier paused to drag a wounded comrade to cover. A medic shouted instructions while attending to injuries, and a young private whispered a prayer under his breath. These small acts, seemingly insignificant against the enormity of war, were in fact the essence of the Buffalo Soldiers' courage, the unshakable commitment to each other, to duty, and to honor. Prejudice could not diminish their valor. Fear could not break their resolve. Every action, every step forward, was a statement that their courage was as real as any man's, regardless of skin color. Hours of fighting stretched into exhaustion, yet the men pressed on. The hilltop was finally within reach, its crest guarded by entrenched soldiers determined to hold their position. Carter signaled a coordinated flanking maneuver, and Corporal Johnson led a small squad around a rocky ridge to surprise the defenders. The element of strategy, combined with relentless determination, turned the tide. One by one, enemy positions were neutralized, and the ridge fell into the hands of the Buffalo Soldiers. Cheers erupted briefly, mingled with groans of the wounded and whispered prayers of thanks. Victory had a high cost, but it was hard-won and undeniable. As night fell, the men set up camp on the ridge, surveying the valley below and the hard-won positions they now held. Fires crackled, casting flickering light over exhausted faces, and the quiet moments were filled with reflection. Private Lewis wrote a letter to his mother, carefully choosing words that conveyed courage without diminishing the terror of battle. Lieutenant Carter walked among his men, offering reassurance, listening to their fears and frustrations, and reminding them that every step they had taken was a testament to resilience. They had not only fought an enemy abroad, they had fought prejudice at home, and survived to demonstrate that valor could not be denied. Somewhere in the distance, villagers emerged cautiously from hiding, offering tentative waves or nods of gratitude. The Buffalo Soldiers had become symbols of liberation as well as strength, their presence a reminder that courage could come from unexpected places. Carter looked over the ridge and felt a swell of pride tempered with sorrow. The cost had been high, but their mission was more than tactical. It was moral. In the hills of Italy, history was being written with every bullet fired, every comrade saved, and every act of defiance against a world that doubted their worth. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, the soldiers huddled together, sharing meager rations, exchanging stories of home, and whispering prayers for those who would never return. They were brothers in arms in every sense, bound by shared sacrifice, unwavering loyalty, and the knowledge that their courage transcended the prejudice they had faced before the war. The hills were quiet now, the battle temporarily at rest, but the spirit of the Buffalo Soldiers burned brighter than ever, an unyielding testament to bravery, brotherhood, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. The morning fog clung to the valley like a heavy blanket, muffling the sounds of war yet concealing dangers that lurked just beyond sight. Lieutenant Carter adjusted his helmet and peered through the mist, calculating the approach to a nearby village that intelligence reported as a critical Axis stronghold. The Buffalo Soldiers had been moving steadily across Italy, each victory hard-won, each advance a testament to their skill and resilience. Yet even as they fought the enemy, they carried the weight of prejudice from within their own ranks, a reminder that the battle for recognition was far from over. Private Lewis moved cautiously through the fields, mud squelching under his boots, rifle tight against his shoulder. He thought of his father, who had spoken proudly of the family's legacy of service, and of the generations of black soldiers who had marched into wars that had barely acknowledged their courage. He drew strength from that heritage, reminding himself that each step forward was an act of defiance. Each shot fired a claim to honor and dignity. Around him, the squad moved in precise formation, their unity a shield against both the enemy and the doubts that lingered at home. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by the staccato of enemy fire. Machine guns ripped through the mist, and Carter dropped instinctively, signaling for his men to take cover behind a crumbling stone wall. Bullets ricocheted off rocks, dirt sprayed into the air, and the valley seemed to convulse under the storm of fire. Corporal Johnson shouted orders, directing men to flank from the left while maintaining pressure on the front lines. Every movement required split-second timing and absolute trust, and in those moments, The soldiers' bond became both weapon and armor. Amid the chaos, Private Lewis spotted a young Italian boy huddled near a destroyed building, terrified and alone. He didn't hesitate. Racing through the open ground under fire, he scooped the child into his arms and ran back to cover. Carter, witnessing the act, felt a swell of pride. Bravery was not measured only in bullets or strategy, but in the courage to protect life even when death hovered close. The boy's tear-streaked face reflected fear and relief, a quiet testament to the humanity that survived even amid relentless violence. Hours dragged on as the Buffalo Soldiers fought their way through the village streets. They cleared homes, rescued civilians trapped in rubble, and neutralized enemy snipers hiding in attics and basements. Each encounter tested their nerves, skill, and determination. Corporal Johnson moved from house to house, calming terrified villagers and coordinating with the squad to maintain momentum. Their mission was tactical, but it was also moral: to liberate a town, protect innocents, and demonstrate that the men of the 92nd Infantry Division were as capable and courageous as any soldier in the Allied forces. The sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the streets strewn with debris. Lieutenant Carter paused to catch his breath, observing the faces of his men, sweat-streaked and grime-coated, yet their eyes held something unbreakable. They had faced prejudice, adversity, and relentless fire, and they had endured. Every village secured, every ridge captured, and every comrade protected was a proof of their courage. The fight in Italy was about more than strategy. It was a fight to claim their place in history, to show a world that had doubted them that valor could not be denied. By late afternoon, the village was secured. Civilians emerged cautiously, offering nods of thanks, gestures of relief, and small smiles that spoke volumes. The Buffalo Soldiers had not only defeated the Axis defenders, but had also won the trust and admiration of a people caught in the crossfire of war. Carter, though exhausted, allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The cost had been high, yet the reward was not measured in territory alone. It was in lives saved, in dignity affirmed, and in the unshakable bond of men who had fought together against impossible odds. Night fell over the village, and the soldiers gathered around small fires, tending to wounds, repairing weapons, and quietly recounting the day's events. Private Lewis wrote a letter home, careful to balance truth with hope, to reassure his family that he had survived, and to honor the bravery of those who had fallen. Corporal Johnson shared a quiet laugh with a younger private, a brief respite from the shadows of fear and fatigue. In those moments, the men were more than soldiers. They were brothers, bound by shared sacrifice and an enduring commitment to each other. As Carter lay down to rest that night, he thought of the country that had questioned their loyalty, the family members waiting back home, and the generations who had served before him. The irony of fighting abroad for freedom while facing discrimination at home was not lost on him. Yet he drew strength from the knowledge that every act of bravery, every victory in battle, chipped away at the walls of prejudice. In the hills and villages of Italy, the Buffalo Soldiers were leaving a legacy not only of military valor, but of moral courage, proving to the world and to themselves that true heroism knows no color. The hills of Tuscany shimmered under the early morning sun, the landscape deceptively serene, masking the scars of war. Lieutenant James Carter and his men moved with deliberate care, their boots sinking into the muddy paths carved by rain and artillery fire. After days of relentless skirmishes, the squad was exhausted, yet each man carried a resolve forged not just in battle, but in a lifetime of proving worth in a world that often refused to see it. The Buffalo Soldiers had already secured several strategic positions, but intelligence now pointed toward a heavily fortified German encampment in the valley. Below, a position that could determine the outcome of the Italian campaign in that sector. Corporal Sammy Johnson, adjusted his helmet, and scanned the ridgeline ahead. The enemy had dug in deep, using the natural contours of the hills to establish machine gun nests, observation points, and trenches. "This isn't just another hill to take," he muttered to Private Lewis. "It's a test of everything we've learned, and everything they think we can't do." Lewis nodded silently, gripping his rifle tighter. Words of doubt from home, whispers of prejudice in the army, and the persistent question of loyalty had long since transformed into fuel. Every mission, every advance, every victory was a declaration. The Buffalo Soldiers were as capable, as courageous, and as committed as any man in uniform. The approach began cautiously, with scouts moving ahead to identify minefields and sniper positions. Carter signaled the squad to split into flanking units, each moving under the cover of olive groves and ruined farmhouses. Bullets occasionally hissed past, striking trees and soil, yet the soldiers pressed forward with methodical precision. Private Lewis felt the sting of adrenaline and fear intermixed, a heightened awareness that every step could be his last. But alongside that fear was an unshakable focus, an understanding that courage was measured not by the absence of fear, but by action in its presence. Hours passed with tense, unbroken focus. They climbed rocky slopes, crawled through narrow ravines, and advanced under intermittent fire. Lieutenant Carter moved like a conductor, orchestrating the squad's movements, directing suppressing fire, and ensuring that the men supported one another. Every glance, every nod, every whispered instruction was imbued with urgency and trust. These were not just soldiers under his command. They were brothers bound by shared sacrifice and unspoken loyalty. At midday, the enemy opened a barrage of fire from a hidden ridge, tearing through the earth and sending debris flying. One soldier fell near Private Lewis, blood soaking his uniform. Without hesitation, Lewis grabbed his comrade's arm and dragged him behind cover, the world narrowing to survival, protection, and duty. The act was instinctive, a reflection of the values instilled in the 92nd Infantry Division. Valor was not merely about personal heroism, but about lifting those around you, ensuring that no man was left behind. The flanking units converged at a narrow pass leading to the German encampment. Machine gun nests and snipers had made frontal assaults costly, but Carter's strategy relied on timing, coordination, and the determination of men who refused to be underestimated. Corporal Johnson led a squad through a thin ravine, crouched low as bullets whipped past. "Move, move, move!" he whispered urgently. Each step was measured, deliberate, and fearless, the men's unity forming an invisible shield against the chaos around them. By late afternoon, the soldiers reached the outskirts of the encampment. Smoke from burning barracks and scorched earth filled the air, mingling with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Civilians who had survived the bombardment watched cautiously from behind walls, unsure whether the advancing soldiers were liberators or another threat. Carter motioned to one of his men to provide reassurance, and Lewis stepped forward, waving and shouting in broken Italian. The villagers' expressions shifted from fear to cautious relief, a testament to the humanity that persisted even amidst destruction. The assault on the camp began in earnest. Grenades were tossed with precision, machine guns provided suppressing fire, and squads moved through streets littered with debris and broken masonry. Lieutenant Carter led a charge up the main road, dodging sniper fire while directing his men to flank enemy positions. The clash was brutal. Shouts, gunfire, and explosions created a cacophony that seemed almost alive. But the Buffalo Soldiers moved with coordination and determination, demonstrating the discipline and courage that had been honed through relentless training and battle. Private Lewis found himself in a small courtyard, facing an entrenched German soldier who had not yet surrendered. Time slowed. Instincts took over. Lewis fired, the recoil jarring his shoulder. and the enemy soldier fell. Around him, comrades advanced, clearing remaining resistance, securing key buildings, and ensuring that civilians were protected from stray fire. In these moments, the soldiers were more than fighters. They were arbiters of justice, navigating the moral and tactical challenges of war with unwavering resolve. By evening, the German encampment had been secured. Exhausted, bloodied, but triumphant, the Buffalo soldiers gathered among the ruins. Fires crackled in makeshift pits as medics tended to the wounded. Soldiers shared what little food remained, and quiet conversations punctuated the aftermath of chaos. Lieutenant Carter moved among his men, offering praise, encouragement, and the occasional gentle rebuke, knowing that morale was as critical as strategy. In their faces, he saw pride, exhaustion, grief, and a stubborn resilience that would define them far beyond this campaign. The victory was not without cost. Several men had been killed, others wounded, and the emotional toll was palpable. Yet in their perseverance, there was a profound affirmation. They had succeeded where others might have failed, proving their courage, skill, and determination. Each man carried not only the satisfaction of a mission accomplished, but also the weight of legacy, the generations of Buffalo soldiers who had marched, fought, and sometimes died without recognition. Here in Italy, that legacy was being cemented, etched in the land and in the hearts of men who refused to be diminished. Civilians emerged from hiding, bringing small offerings of food, water, and gratitude. Lieutenant Carter spoke to village elders, offering reassurance and explaining their mission. The men of the 92nd Infantry Division were both liberators and symbols, their bravery demonstrating that valor transcended the barriers of color and prejudice. The villagers' cautious respect reflected an understanding that these soldiers, often doubted by their own countrymen, embodied the highest ideals of courage, compassion, and duty. As night fell, the soldiers huddled in makeshift shelters, tending to wounds, cleaning weapons, and reflecting on the day's trials. Private Lewis wrote another letter to his mother, struggling to convey the intensity of battle alongside the hope and humanity that persisted even in darkness. Corporal Johnson quietly shared stories from back home, jokes and memories that offered a brief escape from the harshness of war. These moments of connection, laughter, and care were just as vital as the strategies and maneuvers. They were the threads that held the men together, the invisible bonds of brotherhood forged in adversity. Lieutenant Carter finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. The irony of their situation was stark. These men, whose loyalty had long been questioned at home, were now demonstrating unparalleled courage on foreign soil, earning respect from allies and the admiration of civilians who had witnessed their heroism firsthand. Prejudice could not diminish their valor. Hatred could not break their resolve. Every step, every shot, every act of protection and strategy was a declaration. The Buffalo soldiers were essential, irreplaceable, and unforgettable. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, the men slept fitfully. Dreams mingled with memories of home, comrades lost, and battles yet to come. The hills of Tuscany lay quiet, the echoes of gunfire fading, yet the lessons of the day remained vivid. Courage had been tested, humanity had been affirmed, and the bonds of brotherhood had been strengthened. In the stillness, the soldiers understood that their fight extended beyond these hills. It was a fight for recognition, for dignity, and for the honor of generations who had served without acknowledgement. And as dawn approached, painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson, the Buffalo soldiers rose again. Exhausted, scarred, but unbroken, they prepared for the next mission, ready to face the challenges ahead, with the same courage, discipline, and resolve that had carried them through every battle. Their story was being written not only in the hills and villages of Italy, but in the hearts and minds of those who would remember that heroism knows no color, that loyalty and bravery are universal, and that the Buffalo Soldiers had not only fought the Axis, they had challenged the world to recognize the courage that had always been theirs. The weeks that followed brought relentless movement through the rugged terrain of northern Italy. The Buffalo Soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division had earned a reputation among the Allies for their discipline, courage, and tenacity. Yet every village they entered reminded them of the fragility of life in war. Lieutenant Carter led his men cautiously, mindful of both the enemy and the civilians trapped between advancing fronts. Every step was deliberate. Every decision weighted with responsibility for the men under his command. They moved like a single organism, each soldier anticipating the next, each covering the other, a living embodiment of unity forged in fire. Private Lewis had grown in confidence and skill, his earlier fears replaced with a steely focus honed by experience. Yet, beneath the veneer of professionalism lingered the ever-present awareness of prejudice. He remembered the letters from home, the whispers questioning their loyalty, the subtle slights that underscored their second-class status even as they risked their lives for the nation. And yet, in moments like these, dodging sniper fire, rescuing trapped civilians, coordinating a flanking maneuver, he felt a sense of justice. Each victory, each act of bravery was a reclamation of dignity, a statement that courage and honor could not be denied by color. The squad approached a small village rumored to harbor an entrenched Axis garrison. The streets were narrow, cobblestoned, and lined with buildings riddled with bullet holes. Smoke rose from several houses, the acrid scent of gunpowder and burned wood heavy in the air. Carter surveyed the area, noting possible sniper nests and choke points. "Stay alert," he whispered. "We clear this village carefully. Watch for civilians, and watch each other." The men moved forward with a deliberate caution, rifles raised, senses heightened, every footstep a negotiation between survival and duty. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from a ruined building on the corner of the main square. Private Lewis dove for cover, returning fire with calculated precision. Corporal Johnson signaled a flanking maneuver, and a squad moved stealthily along the alleyways, firing in suppression and advancing house to house. Explosions shook the streets, sending stones and debris raining down, but the Buffalo Soldiers pressed forward. Each building cleared was a small triumph. Each enemy position neutralized, a testament to coordination and courage. Coordination and courage. In the chaos, moments of heroism shone brightly. Lewis spotted a young Italian girl trapped beneath a fallen beam, and, ignoring the whizzing bullets, pulled her free. Her small hands clung to his sleeve as he led her to safety, the gratitude and fear mingling in her wide eyes. Nearby, another soldier dragged a wounded comrade out of the open, placing him behind cover and quickly applying first aid. These acts were as critical as the tactical maneuvers. They were proof that bravery was measured not just in combat, but in the preservation of life, in compassion amidst destruction. Hours of fighting stretched into the afternoon. Smoke hung in the air, mingling with dust and the scent of burnt timber, and the streets were littered with the detritus of war. Carter moved from one end of the village to the other, checking on squads, coordinating, suppressing fire, and ensuring that every building was cleared. He felt the fatigue in his bones, yet the determination in the faces of his men fueled his own resolve. Each soldier had been tested, and each had proven themselves in ways that transcended the battlefield. They had proven their worth in a world that had long denied it. By late afternoon, the village was secured. Civilians cautiously emerged from hiding, offering small gestures of thanks and relief. Carter addressed the gathering villagers, assuring them of their protection and explaining the soldiers' mission. Around him, the Buffalo Soldiers tended to the wounded, cleaned their rifles, and assessed the damage. The toll had been high, but the outcome was undeniable. A tactical victory that also symbolized the moral triumph of men who had fought against prejudice both at home and abroad. That night, The soldiers camped in the village square. Fires flickered, casting long shadows over the rubble-strewn streets, and the men spoke softly, recounting moments of the day, sharing memories of home, and offering comfort to one another. Private Lewis wrote another letter to his mother, describing not only the battles, but the small victories of humanity, the civilians saved, the children protected, the trust earned. Corporal Johnson recounted stories from Harlem, eliciting quiet laughter from his exhausted comrades. Even in the darkness, the bonds of brotherhood held firm, an invisible armor stronger than any rifle or bullet. Lieutenant Carter stood apart for a moment, looking over the village and toward the hills beyond. The irony was not lost on him. These men, whose loyalty had been questioned and whose valor had been underestimated, were now instrumental in liberating towns, saving lives and securing strategic positions. The prejudice they had faced at home could not diminish their courage, and the world was slowly taking notice. Every battle fought, every mission accomplished, was a step toward recognition, not just for the Buffalo Soldiers themselves, but for all who had served without acknowledgement. The following morning, intelligence reported a German counterattack intended to retake the village. Carter's men prepared defenses, placing sentries, fortifying positions, and coordinating with artillery support. As the first enemy units approached, the Buffalo Soldiers opened fire with precise discipline, mowing down advancing troops while protecting civilians who had returned to the streets. The clash was intense, a brutal reminder of the relentless nature of war. Yet the soldiers held their ground, their unity and training allowing them to withstand the onslaught. Amid the firefight, Private Lewis and Corporal Johnson worked together to rescue a group of trapped villagers. Bullets whizzed past, explosions shook the nearby buildings, but neither man faltered. They moved with a determination born of purpose, their actions embodying the dual fight they had waged for survival and dignity. When the counterattack was finally repelled, the soldiers stood exhausted but victorious, a tangible proof of their resilience, skill, and courage under fire. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Carter addressed his men. "Today, you've done more than fight an enemy," he said, voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've shown what courage looks like. You've protected lives, you've earned respect, not just on this battlefield, but in the eyes of history." Around him, the men nodded, some silently, some with quiet smiles, understanding that the words were not empty. They were a recognition of the struggle that had defined their service, a validation of the courage they had carried long before setting foot in Italy. In the days that followed, the Buffalo Soldiers continued their advance, moving from village to village, ridge to ridge, facing enemy resistance with the same discipline and bravery. They liberated towns, saved civilians, and coordinated with Allied units, earning a reputation as fierce, skilled, and dependable fighters. Yet even as victories mounted, the shadow of prejudice lingered, a reminder that the battle for recognition extended beyond the fields of Italy and into the hearts and policies of their own country. Through it all, camaraderie remained the backbone of their strength. At night, they shared stories of home, songs from their neighborhoods, and memories of family, creating small pockets of normalcy amidst chaos. They laughed quietly, offered comfort to the wounded, and celebrated each small victory with the knowledge that every step forward was both a tactical and moral triumph. In these moments, the men were more than soldiers. They were proof of resilience, dignity, and the enduring power of brotherhood. One particularly harrowing engagement came when the Buffalo Soldiers were tasked with securing a bridge critical to Allied supply lines. The Germans had fortified it heavily, expecting the advance of American troops. Carter's squad moved under cover of darkness, using stealth and coordination to approach the structure. Snipers fired from hidden positions, and explosives threatened to collapse the bridge. Yet the soldiers pressed forward. Corporal Johnson coordinated suppressing fire, while Lewis and another private disarmed explosives under fire. Their precision, courage, and quick thinking saved not only the bridge, but the lives of countless soldiers who would depend on it for the campaign ahead. By the time the sun rose, the bridge was secured, the enemy had retreated, and the Buffalo Soldiers had once again proven their exceptional skill and bravery. Lieutenant Carter allowed himself a brief moment of reflection, thinking of the cost, the lives lost, and the battles yet to come. The road ahead was uncertain, but the men's resolve was unwavering. They had fought an enemy that sought to destroy them and a prejudice that sought to diminish them. And in every action, every strategic move, every rescue of a civilian or comrade, they claimed a piece of the honor that history had long denied. Them, the chill of early winter, hung over the Italian countryside as the buffalo. Soldiers prepared for what would become one of their most grueling engagements. Intelligence had reported a heavily fortified German position guarding the only viable pass through the Apennine Mountains. Failure to secure it would stall the Allied advance, leaving countless units vulnerable and prolonging the suffering of civilians caught between the fronts. Lieutenant Carter gathered his men, studying maps with the meticulous precision of a strategist who knew the stakes were higher than any one battle. "Men," he said, voice steady but heavy with gravity, "what we do today won't just decide this fight. It will show the world who we are. It will prove what we've known all along, that courage and honor have no color." Around him, the men nodded, each carrying the weight of that statement in their own way. Private Lewis adjusted his helmet, feeling the steady tension in his chest, but beneath it was a sense of purpose he had never felt before. They were not just soldiers. They were bearers of a legacy, determined to carve their place in a history that had long overlooked them. The approach was perilous. Steep ravines, jagged rocks, and hidden mines made the advance treacherous. Carter's squad moved with deliberate caution, flanking the enemy's positions while suppressing fire came from entrenched machine gun nests. The men communicated through hand signals and whispered commands, their coordination a testament to months of training and countless shared experiences. Even as bullets whipped past and explosions shook the earth, there was a rhythm to their movements, a precision born of unity and trust. Private Lewis spotted a German sniper positioned high on a ridge. The scope of his rifle aimed directly at Carter. Without hesitation, Lewis raised his own weapon and fired, the recoil jerking his shoulder, and the sniper slumped silently. A nod passed between Lewis and Carter, a silent acknowledgement that every life saved, every threat neutralized, was both a tactical and moral victory. Around them, the squad pressed forward, clearing trenches, neutralizing machine gun nests, and securing footholds in terrain designed to break men. Hours passed under relentless fire. The ground was torn and scarred, smoke from burning buildings mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Soldiers shouted orders, bullets ricocheted off stone and steel, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the mountains. Yet the Buffalo Soldiers advanced with steadfast determination, covering each other, pulling comrades from the line of fire, and never yielding to fear. Each act of bravery was magnified by the awareness that they were fighting for recognition as much as for victory. In the midst of the chaos, moments of humanity emerged. Lewis spotted a wounded German soldier struggling to crawl toward cover. Without thinking, he offered a hand, dragging him behind a low wall while suppressing fire raked the street. Corporal Johnson tended to a young Italian boy hiding in the rubble, whispering reassurances while returning fire at advancing enemy troops. In the midst of war, the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division displayed not only courage, but compassion, their actions transcending the narrow definitions of heroism. Affirming the dignity of all lives even amidst destruction, by late afternoon, the Buffalo Soldiers had secured the pass, a strategic victory that allowed Allied forces to advance and relieved pressure on units previously stalled by enemy control. Lieutenant Carter moved along the ridge, surveying the hard-won terrain. He saw exhaustion etched on the faces of his men, blood-staining uniforms, and yet a quiet pride glimmering in their eyes. They had endured relentless fire, treacherous terrain, and the constant weight of prejudice. Yet they had triumphed. Their valor had been undeniable, their skill unquestionable, and their humanity shining even in the darkest moments. That evening, as the sun dipped below the Apennine peaks, the men gathered around small fires, tending wounds, sharing rations, and reflecting on the day. Private Lewis wrote a letter to his mother, recounting not the horrors of war, but the courage, loyalty, and camaraderie that had defined the mission. Corporal Johnson shared stories of Harlem, of family, of life before the army, eliciting quiet laughter that seemed almost defiant against the backdrop of devastation. In these moments, the bonds of brotherhood were palpable, an invisible shield that had kept them alive and would carry them through battles yet to come. Word of their accomplishments began to spread through Allied ranks. The Buffalo Soldiers' precision, bravery, and unwavering discipline earned recognition from officers who had once doubted them, a tacit acknowledgement of the skill and courage these men had long demonstrated. Carter allowed himself a brief smile, knowing that their fight had been for more than territory. It had been for respect, for legacy, and for the affirmation that men of color could stand shoulder to shoulder with anyone in defense of freedom. But the war was far from over. The following days brought more skirmishes, each one testing endurance and resolve. Villages were liberated, but resistance remained fierce, and each victory was tempered by loss. Men fell to bullets, mines, and exhaustion, leaving behind empty spaces in the ranks and a lingering ache in the hearts of comrades. Yet through it all, the Buffalo Soldiers pressed on, driven not just by orders, but by the moral certainty that they were proving something far larger than themselves. One night, after a particularly brutal day of engagement, Carter gathered his men beneath the stars. "Look at where we are," he said, voice steady but full of emotion. "Think about everything we've done, everything we've survived. We've fought an enemy that tried to kill us, and a world that doubted us. And yet, here we are, alive, victorious, brothers in arms." The men nodded in quiet agreement, some with tears glistening in their eyes, the weight of sacrifice mingling with the pride of achievement. Private Lewis stared into the night, thinking of home, of his family, of the generations of men who had served before him without recognition. Now, amidst the hills and villages of Italy, their courage was finally visible, undeniable. Each village liberated, each pass secured, each life saved was proof that valor had no color, that loyalty was not bound by prejudice, and that history would remember those who had fought not just for victory, but for justice. In the weeks that followed, the Buffalo Soldiers continued their campaign across northern Italy. Their efforts facilitated key Allied advances, and their courage inspired both comrades and civilians alike. Stories of their heroism circulated through units and towns, whispering a truth long denied. These men, often underestimated, were among the finest soldiers on the battlefield. They had fought both the Axis and the biases of their own nation, proving that honor and bravery could not be constrained by skin. Eventually, the war in Italy drew closer to its conclusion. The soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division had endured countless battles, faced relentless prejudice, and made profound sacrifices. Yet, as the final Axis positions crumbled, they stood as living proof of resilience, courage, and moral fortitude. Lieutenant Carter watched his men, weathered but unbroken, and felt a deep sense of pride. They had carried more than rifles and ammunition. They had carried the legacy of generations, the weight of history, and the unyielding power of brotherhood. Even after the guns fell silent, the Buffalo Soldiers' journey continued. They helped rebuild villages, tended to survivors, and ensured that civilians could begin the slow, painstaking process of reclaiming their lives. Letters sent home carried stories of liberation, bravery, and shared humanity, spreading the knowledge that these soldiers had not only fought for victory, but had exemplified the highest ideals of service and honor. Lieutenant Carter and his men returned home months later to a nation still grappling with its own contradictions. The recognition they deserved was slow, tempered by lingering prejudice, yet their deeds in Italy could not be erased. Newspapers, letters from Allied officers, and the memories of civilians attested to their heroism. They had fought not only against the Axis, but against centuries of systemic doubt and discrimination. And they had triumphed in ways that were both strategic and profoundly moral. Private Lewis, standing once again on American soil, reflected on the journey. He remembered the hills, the villages, the comrades lost and saved, and the countless moments of courage that had defined their service. They had endured battles that would have broken lesser men, navigated a world that questioned their worth, and emerged not only victorious, but dignified. The Buffalo Soldiers had left an indelible mark on history, a testament to the truth that heroism is measured by action, unity, and the refusal to be diminished by the prejudices of others. And so, their story endured, whispered in letters, remembered in the villages they liberated, and etched into the broader tapestry of World War II. The Buffalo Soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division were more than fighters. They were pioneers of courage, guardians of dignity, and brothers in arms who had fought and won a battle far larger than any single engagement. They had faced hatred and war alike, and through both had proven that valor, honor, and humanity cannot be denied. The war had ended, but the echoes of battle still lingered in the hills and valleys of Italy. Lieutenant Carter stood on a quiet ridge overlooking a village they had helped liberate months ago. The rubble had been cleared, homes rebuilt, and life slowly returning to the streets. Yet the memory of fallen comrades remained vivid. Each hill they had climbed, each street they had fought through, carried the weight of sacrifice and courage that would never be forgotten. He thought of Private Lewis, Corporal Johnson, and the countless men who had faced bullets, prejudice, and exhaustion, and had endured with dignity. Back in the United States, the return home was complicated. They were hailed as heroes by some, yet met with the persistent shadow of discrimination by others. The very country they had risked everything to defend had once questioned their loyalty, their worth, their place in the armed forces. But Carter and his men carried a quiet triumph in their hearts. Their valor had been undeniable, their heroism witnessed not just by commanding officers, but by the civilians they had saved, the villages they had liberated, and the generations of soldiers who would follow in their footsteps. Private Lewis walked through the streets of Harlem months after returning, observing familiar faces and familiar streets, yet seeing everything differently now. He had seen humanity in the midst of chaos, courage in the hearts of men often dismissed by society, and brotherhood stronger than any adversity. The war had changed him, yet it had also affirmed something he had always known. Courage is not determined by the color of your skin, but by the actions you take when it matters most. The Buffalo Soldiers had carried more than rifles and equipment across the mountains and villages of Italy. They had carried the weight of history. Each battle fought, each life saved, and each town liberated was both a tactical victory and a moral assertion. That honor, loyalty, and bravery belong to those who embody them. Regardless of the barriers imposed by society, their service had challenged assumptions, defied prejudice, and set a precedent for generations yet to come. Years later, when ceremonies and reunions were held to honor the contributions of black soldiers in World War II, Lieutenant Carter, Private Lewis, and Corporal Johnson attended quietly. Their medals and commendations tangible proof of their deeds, but it was the memory of their fallen brothers, the laughter shared, the hands held under fire, the lives protected, that remained the most sacred testament to their courage. They had fought not only for victory overseas, but for recognition at home, and, in doing so, had rewritten the definition of heroism for their generation and those that followed. The legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers endured in subtle ways. In the soldiers who came after them, in the communities inspired by their service, and in the history that finally acknowledged their valor. In the hills of Italy, villagers still remembered the men who had liberated them, and in the hearts of the soldiers themselves, the bonds forged in battle remained unbroken. Their story was a reminder that courage is not always recognized immediately, that the fight for justice may extend beyond the battlefield, but that true heroism leaves an indelible mark on the world. Lieutenant Carter stood one last time on the ridge, the sun setting behind the Apennine peaks. He thought of all they had endured, the battles, the losses, the victories, and the quiet moments of humanity amidst chaos. He thought of the men who had stood beside him, men who had carried the legacy of generations, men who had proven that valor and dignity were inseparable. A breeze swept across the ridge, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the hills themselves whispered their thanks. Private Lewis returned home, greeted by family and friends, yet carrying a quiet solemnity. He understood that the war had changed the world, but more importantly, it had changed him. He had witnessed what it meant to be brave, to be loyal, to be honorable even when the world doubted you. And he knew that the story of the Buffalo Soldiers, their battles, sacrifices, and triumphs, would endure long after medals were set on shelves and newspapers forgotten. The Buffalo Soldiers had fought the Axis powers, but they had also fought prejudice, injustice, and the weight of history. Their victories in Italy were etched not only into maps and reports, but into the hearts of those who witnessed them and the generations who followed. They had shown the world that courage is universal, that honor transcends race, and that the bonds of brotherhood can withstand even the fiercest storms of war. And so, their story endured, not just as a tale of battles won and territories liberated, but as a testament to the unyielding spirit of men who refused to be diminished. The Buffalo Soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division had carried more than weapons. They had carried hope, pride, and a legacy that would forever remind the world that heroism knows no color. The sun finally dipped behind the mountains, bathing the valley in golden light. Lieutenant Carter, Private Lewis, and Corporal Johnson stood quietly together, a small group of men who had faced death, prejudice, and the trials of war, and emerged with their humanity and honor intact. They had fought, they had survived, and they had triumphed in ways that no one could ever take away. And in the end, that triumph was more enduring than any medal, more lasting than any report, and infinitely more powerful than any prejudice they had faced. The hills of Italy remained, scarred but alive, forever bearing witness to the courage, sacrifice, and unwavering spirit of the Buffalo Soldiers. Their story, once overlooked, now stood as a beacon of valor and resilience, a reminder that true heroism is forged not just in victory, but in perseverance, dignity, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood.